Hello and welcome to another episode of Peace at Last, the podcast that discusses the latest scientific discoveries in psychology, explains techniques and principles from ancient spiritual traditions, and gives you the mental technology to put them into practice. You can change the way you feel and find peace at last. My name is Fabrice Naïve, psychologist, coach, and spiritual explorer. If this podcast speaks to you, you may subscribe on the platform of your choice. I also invite you to share your favorite episode with some of your friends. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word and support the podcast. You are listening to episode number 6, and today we're going to look at the last group of thinking traps called Personalization. But before we do this, I'd like to thank Derek Gurney, who left a comment in the show notes of episode 1. Derek wrote, I'm a long-time listener of the Feeling Good podcast, and I think your podcast will also become one of my must-listens. Thank you for doing it, and I look forward to the episode where you talk about how you overcame your limiting core beliefs to start it. Thank you for your vote of support, Derek. But Derek also asked the following question. One small note. The link to the handout doesn't show up in the show notes in the Overcast podcast player. I checked, and show notes for other podcasts do have links in them, so I don't think this is a limitation of Overcast. Or by show notes, do you mean the notes on this website? If that's the case, maybe direct people to your website when you say show notes, as I've come to think of show notes as the episode description that appears in a podcast player. Well, thank you for the question, Derek. I suspect that other people have similar questions regarding the show notes. So when I refer to show notes, I am talking about the page associated with this episode on the website peaceatlast.us. That is the official place for the show notes, and they are formatted in a way that I hope is the most legible. But many people also read the show notes directly on their podcast app. This version of the show notes is a copy of the official one that has been embedded into the audio episode. Because of the large variety of podcast apps, some display the show notes in a nice format, others less so. Also, the associated handouts are sometimes linked directly from the app, or sometimes you have to click on the link to the website page on peaceatlast.us. Because I don't have the resources to make sure that all the podcast listening apps display the show notes in the best way, I will ask you to visit my website instead if you want to be sure to be able to read the entire text and have access to the downloadable handouts. It will also be the best way for you to share the episode with your friends. Another thing I wanted to mention was brought to my attention by my wife. The example of mind reading that I gave in the last episode was totally sexist. If you recall, I had a hypothetical couple where the man was worried about not being smart enough and the woman was worried about not looking good enough. Of course, that was 100% stereotypical. Thinking like a dinosaur, I just reinforced old stereotypes in my failed attempt at reaching the broadest audience. I'm sure many of you out there may have felt offended, as did my wife, and I'd like to make amends to you and to her publicly. I've really got egg on my face, and I'm feeling kind of bad to have sounded so reactionary when I want to see myself as this open-minded kind of person, you know? I'm sure I'll make more faux pas like this one as time goes by, so don't hesitate to send me your comments and put me back on track. As always, I welcome your feedback, positive or negative. As my teacher Byron Katie would say, I always try to appreciate the gift of criticism. For those of you who will listen to this episode shortly after its publication, you will know that the world is at the moment under the spell of a pandemic of COVID-19, aka the coronavirus. As a result, the stock market has dropped by more than 20% to date. Now is a perfect time to examine what thinking traps you are engaging in. If I had to make a guess, most likely culprits would be fortune-telling, catastrophizing, maybe overgeneralization, and also the ones I'm about to talk about in this episode. So if I were to make a prediction, it would be that a year from now, that would be March 2021, The coronavirus will already be a distant memory for most people, except those who were affected personally, and the stock market will have resumed its upward curve, going back to business as usual. But that would be fortune-telling. So, the next 4 thinking traps I'm going to talk about are grouped under the category personalization. We commit these distortions when we cannot step outside of our own egocentric perspective. The 4 thinking traps in this group are personalization, also called me or self-blame. Number 2 is blame, also other blame or them. The third one is emotional reasoning, also called Naïve realism or affective realism. And the fourth one is should or should statement. So let's go through each one in turn. Number 1, personalization or self-blame. This is when you assume that your problems are your entire responsibility and you see yourself as the cause of some external negative event, even though you were not responsible for it. So for instance, if you're out with friends and you notice that they don't seem to be having a good time, you may feel responsible for their lack of enjoyment. And you may be more inclined to think this way if you receive criticism for your actions. This is unfortunately common among victims of abuse, according to Martin Seligman's explanatory style. He writes that there are 2 types of self-blame. One is character self-blame. This is undeserved blame that's based on your character or how you see it. You believe that something is fundamentally wrong with you, and that's what caused you to deserve to be victimized. Even if you're not a victim of abuse, it is true that everyone encounters life struggles. When you fall into this thinking trap, you see these inevitable struggles as the result of some character fault. And the key emotion here is shame. If you feel ashamed, you might be personalizing. The other one that Seligman writes about is behavior self-blame. And so this is also undeserved blame, but is based on your actions. You believe that you did something wrong and that you should have acted differently. In other words, you feel like you're at fault. The key emotion here is guilt. In the second case of behavior self-blame, the distress might be less than that for character self-blame, or it might even be of shorter duration because guilt is an emotion that gives you more of a sense of control. We experience greater psychological distress when we believe that we had more control over a past action. And that makes complete sense because we cannot change what happened in the past, and that leads to a feeling of helplessness. If I believe, however, that I can do something about the problem moving forward, I will feel less distress. A subgenre of personalization is helplessness. That's when you believe that the situation is immutable, that it affects everything in your life and you have no power over it. And that's another area where Martin Seligman did a lot of research. Second thinking trap is blaming, other blame, or also known as them. And it's the flip side of personalization. And that's when you believe that other people or circumstances are responsible for the damage they cause. In particular, you assign to someone an intention to create harm when they may not have such an intention. Blaming is a double-edged distortion because there's a shadow side to it. When I blame someone else for my problems, I may be giving away my power and agency, but I'm also letting go of my responsibility. So there's a subtle reward in putting the blame on others because it exonerates me from being accountable. And because of that, I may have some resistance to let go of blame. Here's a subgenre of this, and it's always being right. And this cognitive distortion is pushing the shadow side of blaming, where we need to see ourselves as so pure that being wrong is unthinkable. As we fall into this trap, we actively try to convince ourselves and others that our beliefs are correct and that our actions are righteous. And in the process, we totally run over other people's feelings. third one is emotional reasoning, or naive realism, or affective realism. We fall into this thinking trap when we believe that our emotions are the evidence of the truth. That's why it's a naive realism. It's the flip side of how our thoughts create our emotions. In episode 3, as I explained how emotions are constructed, I talked about emotions being a concept or complex made by the accumulation of a multitude of experiences and the affect that was associated with them. When we find ourselves in a situation that reminds us of the concept, we may experience a certain affect which we readily interpret also as an emotion. So let's say, for instance, that I grew up in a family where going to lunch at my grandparents', my mother's parents, meant that I had to be scrubbed clean, I had to wear some uncomfortable Sunday clothes, I had to keep quiet while I was eating, and not leave the table to go play until all the adults were done. In other words, a big pain in the butt. Today, decades later, let's say that my wife notifies me that we've been invited to a lunch at the Jonesies. I may feel myself stiffen. I may not even be fully aware of why. I just notice my stomach tightening, my heart sinking. This is an affect with a definite negative valence. I may unconsciously decide that it means I'm anxious, and I may make excuses not to go and come up with a rationale that the Jonesies are just a nuisance, and even get angry at my wife for wanting to go. Emotional reasoning can also turn into overgeneralization. We feel bad in the form of anxiety, embarrassment, uneasiness, nervousness, fear, depression, and so we assume that life is bad because we feel bad, at least in that moment. What other examples would be, if I feel fearful when sitting in an airplane seat, I would conclude that it means that airplane flying is dangerous. Why else would I be afraid then? Here's another example. If I feel jealous when my spouse goes out without me, I may erroneously conclude that it proves that my spouse is unfaithful. If the emotion/affect is tied to some self-judgment that we've made about ourselves countless times in the past, we may give more credence to that judgment. So if the emotion is tied to my self-judgment that I'm useless, I will take that as yet another proof that indeed it's true. The short version of this is, I feel useless, therefore I am useless. And I want to open a parenthesis here about the usage of the words I feel. As I said in episode 3, for the uninitiated person, the words I feel are often followed by a belief or judgment. So when I say out loud or to myself, I feel useless, I really mean this. I believe that I am useless. And as a result, I experience this complex set of body sensations and affect, as well as the associated thoughts that I have experienced many times in the past. And that always bring me to this emotional place, which I now call feeling useless. We could say the same thing about the sentences, I feel rejected, I feel incompetent, I feel unsupported. In all those sentences, replace the words I feel with the words I believe that I am. And then check out your new perspective. In Shona Adams' paper on the theory of cognitive distortions, she argues that when an emotion with a negative affect arises in us due to some trigger, it creates a mini state of emergency in our brain, which inhibits the logical part of our brain. Then we only pay attention to the message conveyed by the emotion and not to the actual evidence. Number 4, and the last one, is shoulds, or should statements. We tend to have a model in our head of how the universe is supposed to work. And that includes ourselves, others, our communities, our bodies, the government, the economy, even the cosmos. However, one thing that I notice about all those peoples and things is that they will behave the way they will behave, and I don't get a vote. And yet, if I attach stubbornly to those rules that I have set for the universe, like the little God that I am, and the universe does not follow the rules, I start having some pretty uncomfortable emotions. So if one of those rules is, I should exercise, when I notice myself sprawled out on the couch, here comes the guilt. If another one is, people shouldn't lie, and I catch my friend lying to me, I'm going to feel angry. If yet another rule is, there should be peace in the world, and I hear on the news of innocent lives being lost in a military attack, I will feel sad. Albert Ellis was one of the first ones to point out that we make those must or should statements. He liked to call that tendency musturbation. Using should statements is akin to arguing with reality. And as Byron Katie would say, when I argue with reality, I lose, but only 100% of the time. Here are some variations on the should statements. One is perfectionism. It's essentially the tendency to only be satisfied when you get an A+ on your report card, no matter what domain of accomplishment we're talking about. It's a should statement really pushed to its extreme. Another variant is comparison. That consists in observing how other people are doing, specifically people who seem to be doing better than us, and judging our own self-worth based on that measuring stick. We're telling ourselves that we should be doing as well as or better than those other people. Another one is the fallacy of fairness. And that is when our sense of justice makes us want for life to be fair. Yet we live in an unjust world, and life at times is unfair. In this variant of an argument with reality, we experience emotions such as anger, outrage, frustration. In all those cases of should statements, saying that they are thinking traps or cognitive distortions does not mean that you have to give up improving the world or yourselves. If you are being treated unfairly, by all means take control of your own destiny and make your world a better place. But you don't have to indulge beliefs that tell you that it was supposed to be otherwise. It is the way it is, and arguing about it only brings you grief. On the other hand, recognizing the way things are allows you to assess your reality and take action based on that assessment. This reminds me of a poem by Jane Kenyon called Otherwise that I feel inspired to read to you. I hope you like it. Otherwise. I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birchwood. All morning I did the work I love. At noon, I lay down with my mate. It might have been otherwise. We ate dinner together at a table with silver candlesticks. It might have been otherwise. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the walls and planned another day just like this day. But one day, I know, it will be otherwise. So here's the practice for these thinking traps. To overcome the tendency to personalize, we need to remember that the universe is working in a perfectly lawful manner and that things happen mostly outside of our control or even of our awareness due to the billions of factors that are beyond our understanding. So one technique is called reattribution. When you put the blame either on yourself or on others for a problem, you can begin to consider all the possible factors that contributed to it. Let's say that you get passed over for a promotion at work, and your first reaction is to blame yourself and start labeling yourself incompetent and a loser, what other factors may have contributed to the situation? You may find that your boss was not aware that you were interested in the job. The company may have a rigid internal policy of who gets promoted when. Budgeting issues made it impossible at this time, and so on. In another example, you might take personally the fact that your spouse is grumpy with you when coming home. It may have nothing to do with you, but they may have had some difficulties at work. Also, if your girlfriend does not text you back within 15 seconds, that does not mean that she is ready to dump you, but more probably that she's busy with something else. Next technique is the acceptance paradox. If you have an instance of self-blame or should statement or perfectionism, and it seems to rob you of your self-esteem, you can use the acceptance paradox. Here, you can look at reality and accept your perceived shortcomings in complete peace. You can acknowledge that you may have some flaws as any human being, but that's par for the course. You can even start to see the humor in it. In fact, the preciousness of each human being lies within their inherent brokenness. This is a spiritual principle. Here's our last technique. It's the semantic method. To overcome the absolutism of a should statement or of musturbation, the semantic method uses kinder, gentler language. It turns a must into a preference. If you're attending a class and you find yourself falling inexorably behind, you may have the thought that you need to be able to learn more quickly, that you must keep the pace of the class, or that you should be smarter. Instead, what you can do is you can acknowledge that it would be preferable to have all that, but that it does not diminish your value as a human being. You're human and cannot be expected to hit the bullseye every time. So you go from must to preference. And this concludes our 3-part series on thinking traps. In the show notes for this episode, you will find a table that summarizes all of them, along with a list of techniques that I described on how to undistort your thinking. For each group of distortions, I have also given you a set of techniques, but it isn't that clear-cut, because as I had mentioned, all those distortions overlap quite a bit. So feel free to use whatever technique appeals the most to you, and if it doesn't work, just try another one. So in the handout, I haven't separated the techniques by group or by distortion, but I've listed them all in one bunch alongside the list of thinking traps. This concludes this episode of Peace at Last. For more information, go to peaceatlast.us, where you will find the show notes for this episode. If you have comments or questions, leave them on the website, or you can email me directly at fabrice@life.net. I may be selecting your question as a topic for a future episode. If you just discovered this podcast, I invite you to subscribe on iTunes or on the platform of your choice. If you like this podcast and you want to support it, tell a friend who may not be familiar with podcasting and show them how to subscribe. I also invite you to go to iTunes and leave a review with a 5-star rating. It will help other people discover this podcast. I am Dr. Fabrice Naïve, and I invite you to join me next time for another episode of Peace at Last.